Welcome back to Philosophizing with a Hammer, and in our last episodes, we explored Kafka's The Trial and examined Foucault's concept of the panopticon through an existentialist lens. And today, we continue our journey with Kafka, but this time we turn to the Metamorphosis. It's one of the most haunting and deeply existential stories ever written. So, might as well grab a coffee, settle in, and let's dive into the mind of Kafka. The weight of existentialist thought can teach us a lot about our own world today. Specifically, what we're going to discuss today, the Metamorphosis. All right, imagine waking up one morning and realizing you are no longer a human. Like, literally, you're no longer a human. You're an insect. This is not a metaphor. This is how the book begins. This is exactly the fate of Gregor Samsa, a traveling salesman who wakes up to find himself transformed into a monstrous bug. But the real horror of the story isn't the transformation itself. It is the response of those around him. At first, Gregor worries not about his monstrous form, but about the being late for work. Imagine that, you wake up one day as a bug, as a cockroach, and the first thing you think about is how you're not gonna go to work and how your job is gonna be affected by that. His primary concern is his job, which is supporting his family and fulfilling obligations, which is an early sign of the alienation Kafka explores throughout the novel. His parents and sisters, initially shocked, soon grow resentful. Once dependent on him, they begin to see him as a burden. Over time, Gregor deteriorates, both physically and mentally. He loses his ability to communicate. He becomes confined to his room, and he is treated as an unwanted creature rather than a person. His family stops acknowledging his humanity altogether. And eventually, in one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in literature, Gregor dies alone, unwanted, and forgotten. His family, now free of their burden, moves on as if he had never existed. It's an oversimplification of what happened in the story, but the details, the amount of details, especially the scene of his death, are truly haunting. And that's the Metamorphosis in a nutshell, basically. It's a story about transformation and the terrifying consequences of losing one's identity in a world that demands productivity and utility above all else. And Kafka doesn't just tell a horror story about waking up as an insect. The deeper horror is existential. Kafka poses a question: what does it mean to be human? And what happens when society no longer values you? What happens when you no longer have control over your existence? Let's break it down through the existentialist lens. Kafka's world is one where meaning is slippery. Gregor wakes up as an insect and no explanation is given. Just like the trial, if you remember, where Joseph K. is arrested without ever knowing why, this is pure absurdity. As Albert Camus would argue in The Myth of Sisyphus, the absurd is the confrontation between human desire for meaning and the indifferent universe. And Gregor's transformation is absurd, basically, but so is his reaction. He doesn't ask why. I, as a reader, I was asking this question throughout the pages, like, why? Why is this happening? But he never poses such questions. He asks how he can still go to work. Who the hell would think about that? This reflects the alienation of modern men. You see, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir explored the alienation, this exact alienation, in their existentialist philosophy. When individuals are reduced to their function in society, they become cogs in a machine, objects rather than subjects. Gregor is useful as a worker, but the moment he loses that utility, he is cast aside. Just like in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, Gregor is trapped in the inauthentic experience and existence imposed on him by others. His family no longer sees Gregor. They see an inconvenience, basically. This ties into the broader existentialist question of self-definition. In Sartrean terms, existence precedes essence. This is the pure form and definition of what existentialism is. Your existence is what defines your essence. And so your existence precedes your essence, meaning that humans must define themselves through their actions. Yet, Gregor never gets the chance. His existence is defined by the roles imposed upon him by society, and the transformation simply makes this explicit. When Gregor ceases to function as expected, he becomes invisible, an object to be disposed of. You know, the first thing you do when you see a cockroach is try to get rid of it. That's what his family basically was trying to do. And more broadly, this reflects the struggle between subjective identity and external perception. Sartre's concept of the look describes how others define us through their gaze. And Gregor, once seen as the responsible provider, becomes nothing more than a grotesque problem. His family's rejection is existential violence, denying his subjectivity and reducing him to an object of disgust. Existentialism warns of the dangers of living an unexamined life. As the Greek saying says, the unexamined life is not worth living. I believe it was said by Protagoras. This is dictated by societal expectations, and Gregor, before his transformation, was already alienated. His life was mechanical, driven by duty rather than self-actualization. The Metamorphosis merely reveals the truth. He was never truly living, and his death is the final confirmation of his disposability in a world that only values the useful. If you look at, for example, Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, it is the driving force behind self-overcoming and ambition and the assertion of one's own existence in defiance of external conditions, as we have seen in previous episodes. I do recommend checking that episode out, Nietzsche and the will to power. If you compare that to the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa embodies the complete negation of this idea. That's why there is a unique, comparison between Nietzsche and Kafka. One is contrary to popular beliefs. He is optimistic, that is Nietzsche. The latter is purely pessimistic Schopenhauerian writer who thinks of life as nothing but a burden. And if you look at Gregor's transformation into an insect, it does not spur rebellion or resistance, or even an attempt at self-definition. Instead, he passively succumbs to his fate, allowing the circumstances of his existence to dictate his identity rather than shaping it himself. The absence of will to power is a crucial element of Gregor's tragedy. And from a Nietzschean perspective, Gregor is the last man, the figure Nietzsche warns against in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. A being who avoids struggle, who does not strive, who does not create meaning, but instead resigns himself to his imposed condition. You see, the idea of the last man seeks comfort and security, even if it means embracing mediocrity and suffering. Gregor, before his transformation, had already shown signs of such passivity existence. And his life was mechanical, driven by duty and dictated by external expectations, those of his employer, his family, and the rigid system in which he functioned in. His transformation merely lays bare what was already true. He was never truly asserting himself to begin with. And his reaction to waking up as an insect is particularly telling. He does not question why this has happened. He does not rage against fate, nor does he seek to escape his condition. His first thoughts are about work, his obligations, and the inconvenience of his situation. This immediate concern with external duty rather than self-actualization reveals a fundamental lack of the will to power. He does not seek to impose his will upon the world. Instead, he internalizes the role that has always been imposed upon him. Even as an insect, he thinks like a worker, a cog in a machine, a creature defined by duty rather than selfhood. Nietzsche would diagnose Gregor's condition as ressentiment. And as a recap of what ressentiment is, the French saying of resentment, it's the psychological state of those who, instead of asserting themselves, they turn to frustrations and they do so inwardly, accepting their oppression and even justifying it. Gregor does not blame his family for their increasing hostility towards him. He does not condemn their cruelty or demand recognition of his existence. Instead, he accepts their rejection as natural, as though he deserves to be cast aside. This is the morality of the slave, the acceptance of suffering as a given rather than the assertion of one's own full potential in life. Moreover, Gregor's passive decline is an embodiment of Nietzsche's warning against nihilism, that is, the inability to create new values, as well as the loss for meaning. Instead of fighting, Gregor withers, his body weakens and his mind deteriorates, and he fades into irrelevance. This is the exact opposite of what Nietzsche calls for amour fati, that is, the love of fate, in which one embraces adversity and transforms it into strength. Gregor does not transform his suffering into power, he simply disappears beneath it. And his death is the final tragic proof of his absence of will to power. He does not rage against his fate, he does not reclaim his dignity, he simply ceases to exist, discarded and forgotten. From a Nietzschean standpoint, Gregor's story is not just a personal tragedy, but a warning. The world will not grant you dignity if you do not claim it yourself. Those who passively accept their fate will be crushed under the weight of their own inaction. If you look at Foucault's theory of power and discipline, for example, what we discussed in previous episodes, this theory offers a compelling lens through which to understand the metamorphosis, particularly in how Gregor's family functions as an institution of control. And just as we discussed with the panopticon, the system in which individuals internalize their own surveillance and conform to expectations, Gregor's existence was always shaped by invisible but omnipresent forces and discipline. And his family did not need to use brute force to control him. Social expectations was enough. And before his transformation, Gregor was the perfect subject of a Foucauldian discipline. He lived under the weight of societal expectations, molded by the demands of productivity, and he worked tirelessly to support his family, not because he personally desired to, but because the struggle of his life had disciplined him into such fate and such role. His identity was entirely defined by his function. He did not rebel, he did not resist, but he internalized the role imposed upon him, much like the prisoners in the panopticon, who obey not because of immediate threats, but because they have absorbed the gaze of authority into their very being. I recommend you to check out that episode 2 of the panopticon. It's just the previous one. And relating it to this today's episode, the moment Gregor ceases to be productive is the moment the disciplinary mechanisms that once shaped him do not disappear, they shift. And the same system that once molded him into an ideal worker now renders him an outcast. His family, who once depended on him, they now resent him. They withdraw their care and strip him of dignity and ultimately erase him. You see, Gregor's fate is not a result of his physical transformation, but of his economic uselessness. His loss of social and his social value it seals his exclusion. And the concept related to Foucault, that is the biopolitics, which is, again, as a reminder, the idea that power operates through the regulation of bodies and their productivity, this concept directly applies here. Gregor is subjected to the ultimate biopolitical judgment. If you're not productive, then you do not deserve to exist. His family does not mourn him. They do not struggle to understand him. They simply erase him from their lives, as one might discard an obsolete machine. And he is a waste at this point, an excess that must be removed for the proper functioning of the system. This is the shockingly hidden cruelty of disciplinary power. It creates people only to destroy them when they are no longer useful or needed. Gregor's suffering is not simply the result of a personal tragedy, but of an entirely structure of power that determines worth solely through utility. His family once depended on him, now flourishes without him. They have found new means of survival, new systems of economic participation, and thus Gregor's continued existence becomes an unnecessary burden. His death is not tragic to them, it is a convenience. In the Metamorphosis, Franz Kafka paints a haunting yet, let's say, deeply symbolic picture of the modern worker's plight under capitalism, aligning closely with Karl Marx's theory of social class and the loss of individuality. Because Samsa's transformation into a giant insect is more than just a surreal event. It is a powerful metaphor of how capitalism treats workers as disposable part of a machine. Before his transformation, as we have said earlier, Gregor was a sole breadwinner of his family, tirelessly working as a salesman to support them. And his value in their eyes and in society's eyes is entirely tied to his ability to generate income. And the moment he can no longer work, his family's attitude shifts dramatically. At first, they show concern, but as time goes on, they grow resentful. Marx's theory of alienation is particularly evident in here. Now, we're just gonna use his theory. I'm not implying that a communist form would be ideal for society. No, it has never been and will never be. But I just appreciate Karl Marx for his theory of social class, because in a capitalist society, workers are alienated from their labor, meaning they don't find personal fulfillment in their work. They simply perform tasks to survive, and Gregor embodies this alienation before his transformation. He works tirelessly at a job he despises, solely to provide for his family. A Sisyphean figure, literally a Sisyphean figure who has no personal dreams or desires, no real relationships, and no identity outside of his role as a worker. And his transformation into an insect only makes his alienation literal. No longer human in the eyes of his family, Gregor is confined to this room that he is trapped in, stripped of his previous role, and ultimately stripped of his very sense of self. And the fact that the first thing he thought about was his job when he turned into an insect is enough of an argument that shows how such individuals, they have already lost their individuality and they are shaped by their capitalistic environment. The way his family reacts to his condition also reflects the brutal logic and tragic, actually, of capitalism in his time. At first, they are dependent on him, much like how the capitalist system depends on the working class to sustain itself. But once he is no longer useful, they cast him aside, mirroring how companies and employers discard workers when they become unproductive. You know, just like a machine, when it stops functioning, just throw it away, toss it out, and bring another one. And it doesn't matter whether due illness, old age, or anything. In Gregor's case, an unexpected transformation, it doesn't really matter. Gregor's rather, who once relied on his son's income, suddenly takes on a job himself, proving that his family and his dependency was not just absolute as it seemed. His sister, initially the most compassionate, eventually loses patience and advocates for his removal, showing how even family bonds, are sadly shaped by economic necessity under capitalism. Gregor's slow decline and eventual death represent the final stage of alienation, complete loss of individuality. Once he stops working, he ceases to be seen as Gregor, the person, the individual, and is instead treated as a problem to be solved. His death at the end is almost an afterthought to his family, who feel relief, rather than grief. Just as capitalistic systems move on without hesitation when a worker is no longer useful, Kafka presents a bleak but eerily familiar reality. In a system that values people only for their economic output, individuality is crushed, and human beings become little more than replaceable cogs in an unforgiven machine. So, ultimately, the Metamorphosis is not just a story of personal alienation, but a revelation of how systems of power shape and define the identity of the individual. Gregor was never free to begin with. He was always a product of control, and his transformation did not change that. It merely exposed it. If you look at the lesson that we could take away from Kafka's work in today's world, the fate of such an individual is not just a nightmarish fiction. It is a reality that continues to manifest in the world today, in ways both subtle and glaring. His dehumanization is not a unique thing to Kafka's time. It is a fundamental part of how contemporary societies operate. Consider the tyranny of utility. Our world still demands constant productivity, measuring human worth by economic output. The moment that someone ceases to be useful, whether due to age, to illness, or unemployment, they often experience the same slow erasure that Gregor endured. In capitalistic structures, people are valued for what they do and they can do, and not for who they are. When values diminishes, the values of individuality and autonomy, they are discarded, much like Gregor was. The elderly, the sick, the jobless, how often are they treated as burdens rather than human beings? Governments and corporations design systems that optimize efficiency, not care, thus reinforcing the idea that one's existence must be justified through labor. The consequences of this ideology are everywhere, from the neglect of vulnerable populations to the way workplaces squeeze as much as they can for productivity. They squeeze workers before replacing them with younger, cheaper, more efficient alternatives. But this is not the only way Gregor's theory remains relevant. His alienation has only intensified in the digital age. Today, countless people find themselves locked away in rooms, unseen and unheard, reduced to nothing more than online avatars or distant messages. The sense of disconnection Kafka captured has become even more pronounced as social interactions are increasingly mediated by screens. Many feel invisible, ignored even in their own homes, disconnected from the very people they once thought they belonged to. The tragedy of Gregor is not just that he transformed into something his family could not accept, but that he was never truly seen to begin with. And then there is the crushing weight of bureaucracy, another theme that Kafka explored relentlessly, something that we have discussed in the episode Kafka and the Trial. This is a theme that Kafka explored relentlessly. And one that pervades modern life in ways that make the Metamorphosis feel so relevant. Whether it is in corporate jobs, government institutions, or bureaucratic systems, individuals are often reduced to numbers, to statistics, just as Gregor ceases to be a son or a person the moment he becomes an inconvenience. So too do the people today find themselves lost in bureaucratic machines that see only function, not humanity. Especially with the rise of AI, employees become job titles, patients become case files, citizens become data points in economic reports. The same logic that dehumanized Gregor persists in institutions that prioritize efficiency over empathy. They prioritize policy over people. This raises a major question. Are we all Gregor Samsa in some way or another? Are we all Joseph K? I leave that to you to answer. Maybe you can share your thoughts with me. But as a conclusion to this episode, let's try to find a way into how we can resist. Sadly, we won't find such answer in Kafka's writings. He offers no solution, only a reflection of despair. The Metamorphosis does not present a path forward. It simply holds up a mirror to a world where meaning slips through our fingers. It's like Kafka was himself wrestling with this question throughout his life, and he wanted his readers to help him find an answer too. It is a world that existence is precarious, where one's value is contingent upon external validations, and where the moment that validation is lost, so too is the right to be acknowledged. You see, Gregor's transformation into an insect is not the cause of his suffering. It is the revelation of a truth that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. That his worth, his place in his family, and even his sense of self were built upon a fragile foundation of economic utility. Once that function was removed, his humanity became irrelevant. And yet, existentialist philosophy refuses to accept this kind of fatalism. Sartre would tell us that Gregor's mistake was in allowing others to define his existence. His entire identity has been shaped by external forces, that is, his job, his family's needs, his obligations, etc. He lived in what Sartre would call bad faith, surrendering his agency to the roles imposed upon him, rather than actively shaping his own essence. His transformation does not fundamentally change this. Even as an insect, his first concern is not his own condition, but how he might still be of service. He is so deeply conditioned to think of himself as a provider that he does not even question whether this servitude has ever been meaningful. Instead of passively accepting his role as a worker, and a son, and a provider, Sartre would argue Gregor should have seized his own freedom, determined his own purpose, and rejected the suffocating expectations that had defined him long before his metamorphosis. The tragedy is that he never does. Nietzsche, on the other hand, would diagnose Gregor's greatest failure as his complete lack of will to power. He does not resist, he does not assert himself, he does not challenge his conditions of his existence, he simply decays. He accepts his transformation not with defiance, but with resignation. He does not rage against his fate. He does not attempt to impose his will upon his new reality. He merely shrinks further into passivity, allowing himself to be erased without a fight. If the Übermensch is one who creates values and affirms life despite adversity, then Gregor is his opposite, a man who, when faced with the opportunity to redefine himself, instead withers under the weight of his circumstances. Nietzsche would see in Gregor the ultimate expression of the last man, the one who does not strive, who does not create, but instead resigns himself to slow and meaningless decline. And what of Camus now? The Metamorphosis is perhaps one of the perfect absurdist horror story, and Gregor's transformation is explained irrational and utterly defined, indifferent to his desires. He seeks understanding, but none is offered. Camus might say that Gregor's true failure was not in being transformed, but in failing to recognize the absurdity of his situation for what it was. Instead of resigning himself to slow, meaningless death, he could have embraced his condition, rebelled against the absurdity, and found a way to live on his own terms, even if only for a moment. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus tells us that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because his task has meaning, no, because he chooses to continue despite its meaninglessness. Gregor, however, does not embrace his absurd fate. He does not revolt. He simply fades, allowing himself to be discredited by the world. We talked about amorphity in one of the earliest episodes, and I guess it could be a good solution if you look at Gregor's case. Imagine that today you wake up and you know that you're gonna live this day exactly the same for the rest of your life. You're gonna reflect on what is meaningful. You're gonna make sure that this is the best day ever, because you're not gonna spend your whole life repeating the same meaningless tasks over and over and over again. You see, this idea of embedding the amour fati, the love of fate, might be something that Gregor could have used in his condition. Waking up and realizing that you're gonna live exactly the same moments forever is definitely a haunting idea, yet a promising one. A promise for change, for creation. Foucault would remind us that Gregor was always trapped within the system of control. His transformation only reveals what had always been true, that he was never truly free. His every action had been conditioned by an invisible structure of power. But if Foucault teaches us anything, it is that recognizing these systems is the first step toward resigning them and resisting against them. Gregor, however, never even attempts this. He does not see his condition as something to fight against. He accepts it. And in doing so, he ensures his own erasure. Now, would embracing any of these existentialist insights have served him? Perhaps, if Gregor had refused to define himself through the expectations imposed upon him, as Sartre suggests, if he had embraced his suffering as a challenge to overcome, as Nietzsche demands, and if he had laughed in the face of absurdity and declared his own meaning, as Camus urges us, or if he had recognized the disciplinary forces at work and sought to dismantle them as Foucault advises, maybe then he could have truly lived, even as an insect. But perhaps Kafka would argue that the weight of the world was simply too much. It is easy to theorize, but it is a burden to put it into practice. Some systems cannot be escaped. That the absurdity of existence will always consume us in the end. And yet for us, here and now, the warning is clear. Do not let the world strip you of your own identity. Do not let yourself be reduced to a mere function, and do not allow yourself to be to disappear unnoticed. Assert yourself. You should fight for your existence and make your own meaning before it is too late. Because if Kafka's world is our world, the only question that remains is whether we will accept it or whether we will resist. Thank you for joining me on this episode on Philosophizing with a Hammer. If this one resonated with you in some way or another, be sure to subscribe. Also, I'd be grateful if you leave a review and share your thoughts so the episode and the podcast can show up for others too. Let's keep breaking things apart, one hammer blow at a time. I don't know how did that one come up, but it just did. Thank you again. Signing off. Until next time.